Nahanni National Park in Canada's Northwest Territories is known as the Valley of the Headless Men, due to a series of mysterious deaths and disappearances. Since 1906, there have been 44 reported deaths or disappearances in the region, with 6 bodies found decapitated near burned camps. In the summer of 1906, 2 brothers of Scottish descent, Frank and Willie Mloud, set out from the settlement of Fort Liard in northwestern Canada for the Nahanni River Valley. Their goal was to search for gold, a goal that attracted hundreds of fortune seekers to the most remote and unexplored areas of the north in those years. The Nahanni Valley already had a grim reputation among the local Dene tribes, who called the area the land of evil spirits, and avoided staying there for long periods, especially in the upper reaches of the river. The region was a vast expanse of canyons, rapids, hot springs, and dense forests, surrounded by the Mackenzie Mountains. The climate was harsh even in summer. Short warm periods were followed by sharp cold snaps. Fog rose from the gorges without warning, and navigation on the river required exceptional skill due to the numerous rapids and waterfalls. In winter, the area became virtually inaccessible. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Daylight hours were reduced to a few hours, and snow cover made any movement dangerous. Frank Mloud was the eldest of the brothers, aged 32. Willie was 4 years younger. Both had experience living in the harsh conditions of the north. They had spent several years in the Yukon, participated in the Klondike Gold Rush in the late 1890s, and knew the basics of survival in the wilderness and of working in gold mines. They were not inexperienced novices who had rushed into an adventure without preparation. On the contrary, the brothers carefully planned the expedition, gathered the necessary equipment, supplies, and weapons. A third companion named Weir was supposed to go with them, a man about whom little is known except that he also had experience working in the north. Before leaving, the brothers informed their acquaintances in Fort Liard that they planned to spend one season in the Nahanni Valley from June to September, and then return before the onset of cold weather. They indicated that they would travel upriver, look for promising areas for gold exploration, and possibly set up a temporary camp in an area where, according to rumors, other prospectors had found gold nuggets. The plan was to return by October 1906. When October passed and the brothers did not return, it did not cause serious concern. In those years, delays of several months were common. Changes in plans, decisions to stay for the winter if supplies were sufficient, broken boats, or injuries that slowed the return. There were no communications in remote areas, and waiting for news from those who had gone into the wilderness could take a year or more. The winter of 1906 and 1907 passed, then spring and summer. By the fall of 1907, the lack of any news was already causing concern among the brothers' acquaintances in Fort Liard. In the spring of 1908, a search expedition was organized. It included several experienced trackers familiar with the Nahanni River, as well as guides from among the local Dene, who agreed to participate despite their superstitious fear of the valley. The group began moving up the Nahanni River in early June 1908, when the water level had stabilized after the spring flood and the weather had become warm enough for long journeys. The search was complicated by the vast territory. The Nahanni Valley stretched for hundreds of miles, with numerous side canyons, tributaries, and areas suitable for camping. There was no precise information about where the Mloud brothers had gone, except for the general indication, up the river. After about 6 weeks of traveling upstream, in an area now known as Deadman Valley, the search party discovered the remains of a camp. The site was located on the bank of a small tributary of the Nahanni River, a few dozen feet from the main channel, in a relatively flat area among dense forest. The camp had been burned. The remains of a tent, charred logs from a makeshift shelter, and charred equipment all indicated that a fire had occurred here. 2 human skeletons lay at the edge of the burned area. The degree of decomposition and the effects of weather and wildlife indicated that death had occurred much earlier, possibly a year or more ago. Both skeletons were decapitated. The skulls were missing. However, the rest of the skeletons were relatively anatomically intact. Limb bones, ribs, vertebrae, everything was in place, with no signs that the bodies had been torn apart by large predators. One of the skeletons lay in a position that caught the investigators' attention. The right arm was stretched forward toward a rifle lying a few feet away from the body. The position of the bones of the hand and forearm suggested that at the moment of death, or immediately before it, the person had reached for the weapon, trying to grab it. The rifle itself was in working order, had not been discharged, and had no visible damage from fire. Based on items of clothing, remnants of equipment, and personal effects partially preserved at the site, the bodies were identified as Frank and Willie Mloud. The third companion, Weir, was missing. His body was not found in the camp or in the immediate vicinity. No traces were found to indicate his presence at the time of the brother's death or his departure from the camp. He simply disappeared. Attempts to reconstruct the events encountered numerous inconsistencies. The absence of skulls could be explained by several versions. The first was that the decapitation was carried out by humans, possibly during a conflict with other prospectors, local hunters, or unknown individuals. The second was that the heads had been carried away by large predators after death. However, the absence of other damage to the skeletons made this version unlikely. Bears or wolves usually scatter bones, gnaw on them, and carry away limbs, rather than limiting themselves to skulls. The murder theory seemed the most likely, but it raised new questions. Who could have done such a thing in such a remote place? Other prospectors competing for gold-bearing sites? But the Nahanni Valley was not overrun with gold prospectors in those years. It had too dangerous a reputation and was too difficult to access. Conflict with local tribes? The Dean traditionally avoided this valley and had no reason to attack a small group unless it encroached on their hunting grounds. Moreover, decapitation was not a typical method of conflict in that region. The fire in the camp also raised questions. Was it the result of arson by the attackers, or did it occur accidentally, perhaps after the brothers' deaths, when the camp was abandoned? The condition of the equipment indicated that the fire was intense, but did not completely destroy everything. Some items remained recognizable, suggesting either that the fire died down quickly or that it was localized to a specific area. The position of one of the bodies, with its arms stretched out toward a rifle, could indicate the suddenness of the attack. The person tried to grab the weapon but did not have time. This suggested that the threat appeared suddenly, possibly from an ambush, and that the brothers did not have time to prepare a defense. However, the second body did not show a similar, defensive, posture, which complicated the interpretation. The search team spent several days in the area of the discovery, trying to find additional evidence. Traces of other people, equipment left behind by the attackers, and traces of a struggle outside the camp. The results were minimal. Almost 2 years had passed since the brothers' presumed death, and any traces on the ground had long since disappeared under the influence of rain, snow, vegetation, and animals. The only clear evidence was 2 decapitated skeletons, a burned camp, and the absence of a third companion. Weir was never found. His fate remained unknown. There were speculations that he might have been involved in the brothers' deaths, perhaps as a result of conflict within the group, a dispute over gold, or accumulated tensions in isolation. According to this version, Weir could have killed his brothers, taken some of their equipment, and tried to leave the valley, but died somewhere else on the way back. However, there was no evidence to support this version. His body was not found, and there was no evidence of conflict. An alternative version suggested that Weir died with his brothers. Still, his body was carried away, hidden or destroyed to such an extent that the search party could not find it. A third version suggested that Weir could have left the group earlier, before the brothers' death, for his own reasons, and the events unfolded without his participation. The place where the Mloud brothers died was named Headless Creek, after the tributary of the Nahanni River, near which the camp was found. The more expansive valley in this area became known as Deadman's Valley. These names have stuck and are still used today. They became part of the grim reputation of the Nahanni Valley, which throughout the first half of the 20th century continued to accumulate stories of disappearances, unexplained deaths, and strange phenomena. After 1908, prospectors continued to venture into the valley, despite its increasingly sinister reputation. Some of them also disappeared without a trace. In 1921, a prospector named Martin Jorgensson went missing and was found dead in a burned-down camp. In 1945, Hunter John O'Brien disappeared, and his body was never found. Gradually, the Nahanni Valley became associated with the concept of a cursed place, where people die in circumstances that defy rational explanation. Local Diné tribes traditionally explained the danger of the valley by the presence of evil spirits, or creatures they called Nakani, or Nukluk. Giant hairy creatures that lived in remote canyons and attacked people. These legends existed long before the arrival of Europeans. They were passed down from generation to generation as a warning to avoid certain areas of the valley, especially at dusk and at night. From a rational perspective, the case of the Mloud brothers remains unsolved. It is officially classified as a murder by unknown persons committed between the summer of 1906 and the summer of 1908. The motive has not been established, the perpetrators have not been found, and the circumstances have not been reconstructed. The absence of the skulls remains the central mystery. It does not fit into typical scenarios of murders for gold, nor into the behavior of wild animals, nor into the known practices of the indigenous peoples of the region. Some researchers point to the possibility of a ritual nature of the murder, suggesting that decapitation could have had symbolic meaning for the killers. Others note that the skull, as a trophy or valuable item, may have been the reason for its removal. Still others suggest that the heads were destroyed or carried away by predators after decapitation. However, this does not explain why the remaining skeletons remained intact. In the context of the broader history of disappearances in national parks and remote areas, the case of the Mloud brothers stands out for several reasons. The decapitation of both victims, the disappearance of a third companion without a trace, a burned camp, the lack of obvious clues pointing to known groups of attackers, and the place's grim reputation long before the event. This combination makes the case one of the most discussed in the history of northern exploration in Canada. In contemporary literature on anomalous disappearances, Nahanni Valley is often mentioned as one of the hot spots, places where the concentration of unexplained incidents significantly exceeds what would be statistically expected. Proponents of cryptozoological theories point to legends about Nakani as a possible explanation, suggesting the presence of unknown large primates in remote areas of Canada. Skeptics note that the combination of harsh conditions, isolation, human greed, and interpersonal conflicts is more than enough to explain most tragedies without resorting to supernatural or cryptozoological elements. Today, the Nahanni Valley is part of Nahanni National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists and climbers visit the region, attracted by its dramatic landscapes. Canyons up to 4,000 feet deep, Virginia Falls at 295 feet, and hot springs among snow-capped mountains. Headless Creek and Deadman Valley remain geographical names on maps, reminding us of the events of 1906 and 1908. Brothers Frank and Willie Mloud were the first in a long list of people whose names are forever linked to Nahanni Valley and its dark reputation. Their decapitated remains, found in a burned camp 2 years after their disappearance, gave rise to the legend of a place where people die in circumstances that defy simple explanation. The disappearance of their third companion, Weir, added another layer of mystery to a case that, more than a century later, continues to be discussed among those who study the history of the North and the phenomenon of unexplained wilderness disappearances. The case of the Mloud brothers was not the only one in the Nahanni Valley. The region's grim reputation, cemented by names such as Headless Creek and Dead Man's Valley, did not deter gold seekers willing to risk their lives for a chance at fortune. Rumors of rich gold deposits continued to attract people, despite the increasingly sinister history of the place. 9 years after the discovery of the decapitated remains of the Mloud brothers, the valley would once again be the scene of a tragedy with a frighteningly similar scenario. In 1917, a Swiss gold prospector named Martin Jorgensson was working in the Flat River area, a tributary of the Nahanni. Martin was about 45 years old. He had come to Canada in the early 1890s, lived through the Yukon Gold Rush, and by the mid-1890s had become an experienced prospector, knowledgeable about the region's geology and methods of searching for gold in northern rivers. Unlike many fortune seekers who came for the season and left empty-handed, Jorgensson approached the search methodically and patiently, selecting promising areas and working on them for months. In the spring of 1917, he settled in the upper reaches of the Flat River, building a small hut on the bank in a place protected from the wind by a thick wall of spruce trees and a rocky outcrop. The cabin was modest but functional, a log structure made from local timber, a roof of bark and branches, a small stone stove for heating and cooking, and a sleeping platform. Nearby was a place to store tools and extracted material. Jorgensson worked alone, which was typical for many prospectors of the time. Partnership meant sharing the finds, while working alone gave him complete control over the outcome, albeit at greater risk. In the summer of 1917, Martin sent several letters to his sister in Switzerland. The letters took a long time to arrive. It took several days by boat to travel from the remote Nahanni region to the nearest post office in Fort Simpson, and then months for the letter to reach Europe via the Canadian postal system and across the Atlantic. In these letters, Martin described his life on the river, the difficulties of his work, the climate, and the nature around him. In one of his last letters, dated late July 1917, he mentioned that he had found a promising site and had begun to extract gold in quantities exceeding his expectations. The wording was cautious. Jorgensson did not specify the site's exact location or give specific figures, knowing that the letters could be read by outsiders. But the overall tone was optimistic. He wrote about his plans to work the site until the end of the season, collect enough gold to return home, and secure his future. This was the last letter his family received. When Martin did not show up in Fort Simpson in the fall of 1917, where he usually bought supplies and sent gold, it caused concern among the small community of traders and other prospectors who knew him. Jorgensson was a methodical man who always kept to his schedule. He would show up in town about once a month, buy what he needed, send his mail, and return to work. His absence for 2, then 3 months was an alarming sign. In the spring of 1918, when the river's ice melted and navigation became possible, a small group was organized to survey the area where Jorgensson worked. The group included 2 local DNA hunters and a prospector who knew the approximate location of Martin's hut. They went up the Nahanni River, then turned into the Flat River tributary, and after a few days reached the area where, according to information, the Swiss man's camp was located. What they found was disturbingly similar to what had been seen 10 years earlier at Headless Creek. Jorgensson's cabin had been burned to the ground. All that remained of the log cabin were charred lower logs and the remains of the stove. Everything inside, the bunks, tools, supplies, had been reduced to ashes and charred fragments. The smell of smoke was still in the air, even though the fire had clearly occurred months ago, probably in the fall. Next to the ruins of the hut, at the edge of the burned area, lay a human body. The degree of decomposition and the effects of winter conditions made identification challenging. Still, based on the partially preserved elements of clothing and personal belongings, the body was identified as Martin Jorgensson. The body had been decapitated. The skull was missing. The rest of the skeleton was relatively intact, with no signs that the body had been torn apart or dragged away by large predators. The picture was almost identical to the case of the Mloud brothers: a decapitated victim, a burned camp, a remote location in the Nahanni Valley, and no apparent clues as to the identity of the killers. The difference was that Jorgensson was alone, while the Mloud brothers were together, and that Martin had a known motive for the attack, the gold he mentioned in his letter. During the examination of the site, no gold reserves, no tools for extracting it, and no signs of where Jorgensson had been working on the river were found. Everything of value that could have been in or near the hut was either burned in the fire or taken away. This supported the theory of murder for robbery. Someone had learned of Martin's discovery, perhaps through an intercepted letter, conversations in Fort Simpson, or observation of his work, and decided to kill him to take the gold. But the robbery theory did not explain the decapitation. If the goal was gold, it would have been logical to simply kill the man, take the valuables, and leave. Why decapitate the body? Why burn the hut? These actions required additional time and effort, increased the risk of being discovered, and offered no obvious advantages to the robber. The decapitation could have had a symbolic meaning, a warning to other prospectors. Still, in such a remote place, where bodies were found months or years later, such a warning lost its meaning. An alternative version suggested that the decapitation and fire were an attempt to conceal the victim's identity and hinder the investigation. The skull, as the most identifiable part of the body, could have been taken away or destroyed to make identification difficult. The fire could have destroyed documents, personal belongings, and anything that linked the place to a specific person. However, the partial preservation of clothing and other evidence made this version unconvincing. If the goal was to completely destroy the evidence, the execution was highly ineffective. The search team spent several days in the area, trying to find additional clues. Jorgensson's work sites along the river, gold caches, and traces of other people who had been there. The results were minimal. Too much time had passed since the death. Winter had erased most of the traces, and wildlife had reclaimed the territory. The only find was a charred metal container, possibly used to store gold dust, but empty. Martin Jorgensson's case was recorded as a murder by unknown persons, probably committed in the fall of 1917. The motive was determined to be robbery. The perpetrators were not found. The investigation did not lead to any arrests. Martin's family in Switzerland received notification of his death and a description of the circumstances surrounding the discovery of his body. His remains were buried in a small cemetery in Fort Simpson, where prospectors and travelers who had died in the wilderness were buried. The second decapitation in Nahanni Valley in 11 years gave the region a reputation not just as dangerous, but as cursed. While the death of the Mloud brothers could still be considered a single tragic incident, the repetition of the scenario with Jorgensson created the impression of a pattern. People began to talk about the curse of Nahanni, about how the valley takes the heads of those who come there for gold. The local Dini, who had always avoided the upper reaches of Nahanni, saw these events as confirmation of their ancient warnings about the Nakanni, creatures that dwell in remote canyons and attack humans. According to their legends, these creatures were giant, hairy, walked on two legs, and possessed supernatural strength. They did not simply kill. They took body parts as trophies or for some ritual purpose. Decapitation in this context was not seen as a human crime, but as an act by non-human beings. Rational researchers pointed out that gold had always been a sufficient motive for murder in remote mining camps. The specificity of decapitation could be explained by the psychology of specific criminals, their cultural backgrounds, or attempts to build a fearsome reputation to control territory. But the lack of any arrests, the complete absence of evidence pointing to specific individuals, and the repetition of the pattern left room for less rational interpretations. By the end of the 1910s, the Nahanni Valley was already firmly associated with unexplained deaths and disappearances. The number of people willing to search for gold in the region began to decline. Those who did venture there worked in groups, avoided solitary camps, refrained from spreading word of their findings, and left the valley before the onset of autumn. Headless Creek and the Flat River became places that prospectors preferred to avoid, even if the geology suggested the presence of gold. Martin Jorgensson's story added to the valley's grim chronicle as the second documented case of a gold prospector being decapitated under similar circumstances. His last letter home, in which he wrote with cautious optimism about the gold he had found, became a bitter irony. What should have secured his future was probably the cause of his death. His decapitated body, found near a burned-down hut in the spring of 1918, became another link in the chain of events that transformed the Nahanni Valley from a remote and harsh region into a place shrouded in legends of curses and unknown dangers that prey on those who dare to seek wealth there.